Alright, let's jump right into this explainer and demystify one of the absolute most enigmatic, mysterious figures in all of ancient literature. Picture this. A man literally walks right onto the page in the book of Genesis, and the text completely refuses to tell you where he came from. He speaks just a few lines, collects a tithe, and then vanishes just as quickly as he arrived. He simply appears, kind of like a massive A-list actor making an uncredited random cameo in a tiny indie film. And the craziest part? The narrative never circles back to explain him.
So what does this all mean? We're looking at a sudden, frankly jarring narrative interruption that begs a massive question. How does a man with absolutely no genealogy command such incredible authority? Honestly, if you were to ask the average person who Melchizedek was, you'd probably just get a blank stare. But this figure is deeply profound. What almost nobody notices the first time they read this is the absolute, deafening silence surrounding him. And, as we're going to see, that silence, it isn't just sloppy editing. It is literally the entire point.
But to really understand the shock of his arrival, we first have to set the stage and look at the brutal regional power dynamics going on at the time. Genesis 14 essentially reads like an ancient war report. You've got this massive Eastern alliance of 4 kings, and they have just swept through the region near the Dead Sea. They've totally crushed a coalition of local rulers, looted the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, and dragged away a bunch of captives, which unfortunately includes Abram's nephew, Lot. Listen, these weren't just minor border skirmishes. This was the ancient equivalent of a world war. This Eastern alliance was a regional superpower, flushed with victory, and literally nobody had been able to stop them.
Now consider the sheer, almost laughable unlikeliness of what happens next. Abram, who is basically a quiet herdsman, arms exactly 318 guys from his own household. That's it, 318. They chase this massive, victorious Eastern army through the dark, launch a night raid, and somehow they win. They actually defeat a regional superpower. Abram recovers all the captives, all the plunder, the whole shebang. There is absolutely zero natural explanation for a semi-nomadic shepherd pulling off a military victory of this scale.
So, imagine the scene. You have a dusty, exhausted Abram returning from this incredible, impossible victory. The king of Sodom rides out to meet him, totally eager to conduct a typical worldly transaction. Keep the wealth, just give me back my people. But then, the narrative abruptly shifts. It literally interrupts the king of Sodom mid-approach to drop a completely unknown figure straight into the frame. There's zero buildup. Melchizedek is just suddenly there, challenging every single ancient expectation of what power looks like.
And this entrance brilliantly highlights a stark contrast between typical worldly power seekers and this entirely new archetype of leadership. Think back to Nimrod, an earlier ruler in Genesis. Nimrod builds empires, he centralizes power, and he organizes humanity upward from below through sheer force. Well, Melchizedek is the exact opposite. He redefines authority altogether. He doesn't build power through violent conquest. He embodies peace, and he mediates blessings standing from above. Abram absolutely could have used his huge military victory to build a fleeting human kingdom just like Nimrod did. But Melchizedek steps in to redirect him toward a much deeper, enduring spiritual ideal.
And watch how he does it. Instead of negotiating territory or proposing some sort of military alliance, Melchizedek brings out bread and wine. He meets this tired, bloodied army not with a flex of dominance or demands for tribute, but with profound symbols of life and nourishment. It's a total paradigm shift. It clearly demonstrates that true authority doesn't exploit people, it gives and it sustains life.
So let's break down exactly who we're looking at here by looking at his name. Melchizedek is actually a compound Hebrew word. Melchi points to a king, and Zedek means righteousness. So his name translates literally to the king of righteousness. And this isn't just a cool nickname. The text is presenting this as his fundamental core identity. On top of that, he is the king of Salem, and that title is rooted in the ancient concept of shalom. Now, shalom isn't just the absence of fighting, it denotes absolute wholeness, harmony, and right order. So, generations before anyone formally explains it, you literally have righteousness and peace perfectly shaking hands in one single man. Which brings us to a crucial point. Centuries before Israel would strictly divide these roles to prevent corruption, this figure safely united the offices of king and priest. You see, later on, Israel would jealously guard the separation between the throne and the altar because, giving one man both kinds of power was a really bad idea. Giving someone the throne and the altar was usually a fast track to absolute tyranny. Yet here is Melchizedek, holding both without even a hint of scandal. And even wilder, he's ruling a Canaanite city right in the middle of pagan territory, yet he already worships God Most High. God already had a witness in the land before Israel was even a blip on the radar.
But here, my friends, is the most shocking detail of all. In Genesis, a book that is absolutely obsessed with tracking who fathered whom, why is there total, complete silence surrounding this man's ancestry? Seriously, Genesis grinds through genealogies because in the ancient world, your ancestry is your identity. It proves your right to exist in the narrative. And yet, this guy arrives with no line behind him and no line in front of him. It's exactly like handing in a highly detailed background check, but the name, the parents, and the date of birth are just left totally blank.
Now, you might be tempted to think this is just an oversight, but this lack of a genealogy isn't something you can just wave off as sloppy editing. It's a deliberate, absolutely brilliant textual gap. It purposely removes him from human limitations and human inheritance. By intentionally leaving his birth and death completely out of the record, the text actually shapes him into a timeless pattern, a mysterious prototype. He's defined by what he does and who he is, not by his human origins.
To really grasp how big of a deal this is, we have to look at the timeline. The mystery of this very brief Genesis encounter literally echoes across thousands of years of ancient history. We start around 2000 BC with Abram's encounter. Then we experience this massive 1,000-year stretch of total silence until King David drops a complete bombshell prophecy. And then, wait for it, 1,000 years after that, the book of Hebrews finally unpacks the entire mystery.
Let's talk about that bombshell. A millennium after Genesis, King David reaches right past the firmly established Levitical priests of his own day to drop this massive, paradigm-shifting hammer in Psalm 110. Speaking directly of the coming Messiah, David writes, "You are a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek." Do you see what's happening? David reaches right past his own royal throne, right past Aaron's altar, to bridge this ancient, obscure encounter to a future, eternal promise.
And when the book of Hebrews later breaks this all down, it draws a fascinating contrast between these two ancient priesthoods. The Levitical system? It was essentially a genetic lottery. To be a priest, you just had to prove you descended from Aaron. It was strictly based on your bloodline, it was completely temporary because people die, and it was strictly divided from kingship. But the order of Melchizedek? It's appointment-based. It's eternal in its textual record, and it safely unites the roles of king and priest. This actually solves a huge theological problem later on, because Jesus descended from Judah, the royal tribe, not Levi, which naturally would have disqualified him from the Levitical priesthood. We can actually trace exactly how authority functions in this moment. In the ancient world, it's a rule that the blessing always flows downhill from the greater person to the lesser person. So Melchizedek blesses Abram, and in response, Abram spontaneously tithes 1/10 of all his war spoils to this mysterious king-priest. Here's where it gets absolutely amazing. Since the future tribe of Levi was essentially still unborn inside of Abram, this exchange proves that the older hidden order of Melchizedek completely outranks the younger Levitical system that would come centuries later.
You see, the traditional Levitical system had a major flaw. It was essentially an endless chain of funerals. It was just a continuous relay of mortal men passing down an office that none of them could actually keep. A priest would serve at the altar, he'd carry the names of the people before God, and then he'd grow old and die. The priestly robe would literally come off of one dead man's shoulders and go right onto another's. It was a system built entirely on people who fundamentally could not stay.
And that, right there, is why the silence in Genesis is so incredibly important. Melchizedek was a real, mortal man, for sure, but his uniquely blanked historical record, the fact that there is no birth and no death listed, functions as a living preview. God deliberately left the record blank to create a silhouette. It highlights a priesthood that exists entirely beyond human inheritance. Melchizedek acts as a bridge, a type, a figure perfectly designed to point right past himself and prefigure the permanent, eternal priesthood of the Messiah. Now, bringing all this ancient theology right down to our own reality, why does this actually matter for you and me? Well, having a mediator who never dies means that you have an advocate whose representation and care for you will never, ever lapse. Think about it. The hands that hold your case before God, they don't change. There is no shift change in heaven. There's no retirement plan. We are talking about a permanent mediator with an indestructible life.
So I want to leave you with one final thought to really chew on. The silence around Melchizedek, it was never actually absence. It was brilliant design. It was a hidden promise tucked away in Genesis thousands of years in advance. So if that ancient textual silence was actually a perfectly designed promise, how might the long, frustrating silences in your own hardships be masking the presence of a priest who will literally never leave his post? Let that thought shape how you wait. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep exploring the incredible depths of these ancient texts. Catch you next time.